So just to introduce myself really quick, my name is Jennifer Oates. I'm an LPC Associate, which stands for Licensed Professional Counselor Associate, here at Eden's Counseling Group in Houston, Texas. I graduated with my master's in clinical mental health counseling from the University of Houston Clear Lake this past May, so I'm a new associate, and I am accumulating hours to head towards full clinical licensure, hopefully in the next year or so. And the title of this, as you all know, is Coping with Anxiety and Perfectionism in Young Adulthood. I do want to say that I'm going to allow questions throughout the presentation, not just at the end. Although if you prefer to save your questions to the end, that's fine too. My moderator for this webinar, his name is Marcus. He has the cool little green tree screensaver that you see on the thumbnails. If you have any questions, if you lose me somehow, or you're trying to ask a question in the chat, or please raise your virtual hand and I miss it, he'll let me know. We can take a pause and answer your questions in the timing that they're received. So just so that you know that. Also, he did put a feedback form in the chat box for you guys to fill out when the presentation is over so that we can learn a little bit more about what you did and didn't like and try to make these presentations better in the future. So this Focus on Wellness series, just to also briefly introduce this, is a free monthly webinar series that Eden's Counseling Group offers on a variety of mental health topics. Previous topics included mitigating symptoms of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, learning about grief, insomnia, couples communication, and various other mental health topics that would be of interest. And I also want to say, now that we're at the objectives part, that this webinar is intended to be an introduction to these concepts of coping with anxiety and perfectionism. They're not going to be a huge deep dive. I'm not going to throw out a lot of neuroscientific terms at you. So if you already are familiar with the way that the body processes anxiety and or certain types of therapeutic approaches to mitigating anxiety and perfectionist thinking, then this presentation might feel like a review to you. But that being said, the objectives here, they're pretty lofty for only an hour-long webinar, but I'm going to do my best to make sure that we address each of them and they kind of feed into one another so that you feel like you're getting the best use out of this time. Again, as an introduction to the way that anxiety keeps us from coping with it and the ways that we can cope with it, and also perfectionism. So those objectives are, just to read them out, are to gain more knowledge and more confidence in your ability to cope, increase self-compassion, decrease feelings of worry, self-criticism, anxiety, and apply these lessons to your personal, academic, or professional aspects of your life. And so I wanted to start kind of the presentation defining anxiety. I think this complaint might date me a little bit, but there's a lot of information in the media these days, especially social media, about what anxiety is or what it looks like. And the term has been a bit overblown out of its clinical sense to apply to a lot of situations where the word worry might be better applicable. And I say that perhaps that might be a personal preference rather than a professional preference, but I prefer to use the word anxiety to describe what is clinical and what's not every day. So an example of that might be, I'm worried about my performance review at work, versus I just have so much anxiety about my performance review. One of those might make more sense if you are someone who regularly mitigates feelings of anxiety or has a diagnosis related to anxiety, and worry is more our everyday. Everybody worries at some point. Performance reviews are stressful, so it would make sense that someone would worry about something like that in the short term. And so with that, I just want to present here the clinical definition of what we would probably consider in its broadest sense anxiety, which would be generalized anxiety disorder. And this is straight from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. which is what psychiatrists and other mental health professionals use to diagnose for insurance purposes and for medical charting. So I have it out here in quotes. I won't read that one to you, but all of these areas in the second sentence where there's restlessness, trouble concentrating, irritability, increased muscle tension, those are all areas that can be actively evaluated and assessed for using different instruments in a therapeutic setting to determine severity of anxiety and the severity of the generalized anxiety in this case. The most common instrument for that in adults is the GAD-7, and it's really short and straightforward, but gives everybody a good idea of like what they're looking at there. And so it's important to note that there's a minimum time frame for this to be applicable to somebody, for someone to be diagnosed with clinical general anxiety disorder, which is 6 months. So if you're anxious for 3 months and it's really bad, but then it ends, that would probably be classified more as an adjustment disorder, something that lasts less than 6 months, but is clearly linked to an identifiable stressor. And we also have social anxiety disorder, which is persistent only in social settings and not overall. Like you're not anxious about death or other things that generally bring people anxiety, versus you're only anxious about how people think of you, what they think of you, how they think of you, when they think of you, all of those kinds of questions. And so that is more, so just to paint a clearer picture of what that looks like in a few common manifestations of anxiety that are diagnosable and clinical, to differentiate from what we might be seeing out in the world that people are calling anxiety, kind of internalizing our anxiety. And so, that semantics are important, I believe, in order to really just describe what's happening in a way that validates the people who are struggling with anxiety, but also still gives people who don't have clinical anxiety a space to still describe that and still have that, but have a differentiation between that. So the more that we can help with that, better. And sometimes people might be described as having an anxious personality, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are clinically anxious by these definitions. And so the last point on here that I really want to touch on, also with being someone who works with trauma, is that clinically diagnosed anxiety and trauma disorders like PTSD are only diagnosed if the effects of a condition significantly impairs an individual's quality of life. That's like DSM-5 101 for diagnosing clinicians. So, if you worry about stuff, but it doesn't keep you from doing what you want to do in life, then it's probably something that you could consider more normative than something clinical or on the more severe side or the moderate side of anxiety. So a good example, people usually use, like, it's easier to conceptualize with depression because it's like, oh, I can't get out of bed, I'm too depressed. And for anxiety, the most severe of that's, oh, I can't leave the house, I'm too anxious. So like put that into perspective, like that's a direct impairment on quality of life, that is easier to look at in like a clinical manifestation. So here's the fun part here. Why do we even get anxious? What is making this happen within us? None of us are choosing to be anxious. It's not fun. It's not something that anybody wants to be. And then how did we become perfectionists? How did perfect become the bar? Why isn't it okay for us to get 80s on tests? Why isn't it okay for us to not be like the perfect husband or wife or partner or whatever we're trying to be? And the human brain, the reality of it is the human brain hasn't had an update, if you will, in hundreds of thousands of years. So the same brain that was telling us, oh, like a tiger bit you once, so, maybe you should be afraid of those because it's not fun to run into a tiger like that. That same brain is here telling us, oh, you bombed that test. Maybe you're just not cut out for college. Or maybe you're just bad at math, or like, oh, we should avoid these things because they're uncomfortable. Oh, you you got dumped in a relationship. Oh, maybe relationships aren't for you. That's not as helpful and informative as it used to be when we were running away from predators or we were at a constant survival risk. So those same things that are triggering that for us in those moments are coming back biologically to try and trigger us now to keep us safe. And so, obviously not helpful in the modern world. And avoidance is a hallmark of anxious thinking as a result. So, like, we have a negative thing happen to us. We want to make sure it doesn't happen again. So, the easiest way to make that happen is to avoid it. If we never encounter it, then we won't have a hard time. If we, actively try to keep it away, then it can't hurt us if we're doing that, like if we're constantly keeping up this effort. But again, then that brings us to the point where how much of that can we avoid in this modern world, depending on what the anxiety is, the severity of it, and how it's popping up for you, because eventually that kind of runs out. And so those anxious and perfectionist tendencies are not just, our biological brain telling us, hey, something may be wrong here, but it's also something we learn from the people around us. We learn that it's helpful to be anxious because then we can keep bad stuff from happening to our children or our relatives, other relatives, or our friends. And we have these things that reinforce, and especially parents teaching kids, like maybe indirectly, but teaching kids like, oh, if we prepare for these things in this way, then we can, keep ourselves safe. I have a client who had a severe driving phobia, and when we talked about it a little bit more to figure out kind of how that developed, like for them over time, they said, my mom used to be afraid to drive at night. She wouldn't drive on certain roads. She would actively shake at the wheel and say out and pray out loud while she was driving us around. And so that kind of behavior definitely reinforces for kids with a blank slate kind of coming into it. Oh, maybe this is like how I should also cope with it. And maybe it's not even a conscious decision either. Eventually, those learned behaviors can come out whether or not we're consciously choosing to do that. And so they're also not just a manifestation of your individual personality. Some people don't have anxious parents or anxious relatives, but they're anxious. And sometimes that's a personality thing, like an individual. But overwhelmingly, there's a lot of genetic correspondence with anxious and perfectionist tendencies. And there's also a piece of like attachment that can create anxious or avoidant tendencies in life. And that's determined in the first 18 months or so of life before you are consciously making decisions of whether, like, how you're going to attach to somebody or not. So that all plays a role in how we get anxious, how we got to be perfectionists. Like, there's a lot that is in our control, but also a lot that wasn't, or that was kind of handed down to us, if you will. And so the last point on here, also related to trauma, is that sometimes anxious thinking and perfectionism develop as a response to trauma, either like relational trauma or to traumatic events. Because hey, if you're perfect, nobody can be mad at you because you did everything right. So that's great. And if you anticipate every outcome, then nothing bad can happen, kind of like what I was saying earlier. But that doesn't always work. When I think of this, I think of, children of alcoholic parents, children of first generation immigrants, not to generalize an overall, but sometimes these demographics can be susceptible to an overcompensation process, resulting in kind of a third parent who ends up being responsible when the quote unquote real parents in the family dynamic are unable to act according to their role, whether that's a language barrier, whether that is intoxication, anything like that. And so without that external locus of control, there is a heightening of the inner locus of control that becomes overdeveloped. So that demonstrates a lot of resilience within those people, but it also it overemphasizes that ability to control others, the actions or feelings of others, when that's actually not possible. But the feeling is like, oh, if I can perform like this, then that can mitigate the way that these feelings are directed toward me, or they mitigate these bad situations or things like that. And so that that is a powerful coping mechanism that makes us responsible for everything that's happening around us. And we, you know, once that kind of coping mechanism gets dismantled, or if it were to be, then the realization would be, everyone is terrible. Like, my mom didn't hit me because I was a bad kid when I was a child. She hit me because she was a bad mom, or whatever the case may be. But the realization then becomes the weight is no longer on you, it was on somebody else. And that can create a huge amount of depression, that can create a huge struggle to integrate like identity into the rest of the world, because all of a sudden people are a lot worse than you thought they were because you just thought you were the problem. And so that can be a really hard point within the trajectory of treating anxiety that we can get to, because once it's kind of acknowledged, like, oh, like we're here, like the anxiety, it really isn't, I am not anxiety, right? Like, I am not anxious, I have anxiety. And like the semantics of that start to take the curtain off of all of that pain that coping mechanism was designed for. So I just want to put that out there. And similarly, like when you look back in your own family history of medical history, you might see, do all women on one side have the same crazy way of thinking, or is there a history of substance use, suicide? Because sometimes anxiety hides between those. When we go back to the genetic factor of like anxious and perfectionist tendencies, sometimes anxiety hides between that or beneath that, because without healthy coping strategies, just like realizing that the anxiety was a coping mechanism, not being able to cope with the anxiety can similarly lead to depression or substance use, because that unmanaged anxiety actually does the exact thing it was supposed to help you do, but inhibits the way that you're actually wanting to live your life, or socially would want to be living your life, to be able to have solid connections and relationships with other people. So now that I've been talking forever, when we go to cognitive dissonance, I broach this subject a lot with my clients when we work on anxiety and perfectionism, because it's one of the reasons why it feels so miserable that we can't really put a name to. And it ends up being, the state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes, especially as relating to behavioral decisions and attitude change. So you can kind of visualize this by like, imagine you were like pulling apart something like this, but inside your head. Because we have on the one side, let's say you want to live a healthy lifestyle, but you have trouble exercising regularly, or you eat too much fast food, or whatever is getting in the way of that. And so that stretching rubber band effect of like, oh, what I really want is over here, but I'm doing this, makes your brain go, oh, like, why are you doing that? Like, what's better. What's better for you and like what you should be doing. So why is what you're thinking not matching up with what you're doing? And so that eventually can create a huge sense of physical stress, because your body and brain can't compute with like the differences in actions and things that you're doing. And so with anxiety perfectionism, this feeling is actually even stronger than it would be for a neurotypical person, because you're putting an extra amount, like it's an extra amount of heavy to have that pull going on in your head, because the pulls on either end are weighted a lot stronger than they are for someone who just has a natural dissonance between two different attitudes or beliefs. And so the distress for especially perfectionism only grows because you're continuing to fail meetings, perfect standards over and over, or face anxiety producing events that you couldn't control or predict over and over and over again. And so it becomes like, why am I not perfect? Why am I not like, why can't I meet this goal? Like, I'm supposed to meet this goal. I'm 100 or nothing. And so it becomes this intensely uncomfortable, like, mental space where you're just feeling at war with yourself, which can lead to feelings of shame and guilt, which are super hard to overcome in terms of how you integrate that into your own version of self, because it just makes it so hard to believe that you could do anything better than what you already tried to do or failed to do. And so, and again, and related to the anxious brain's response to stress, clinical anxiety versus a neurotypical brain. The brain is working overtime to protect from perceived threats. That's that biological, old, outdated component that we were talking about. It was supposed to keep you from danger. Now it sends you into a series of spiraling, like, what ifs. What if I get hit by a car when I leave the office? What if I get home and my child choked on an action figure? Like, constantly going, that just keeps you up at night or keeps you from focusing on conversations because you're constantly worried, what are they thinking of me while I'm talking about this? All of those kinds of anxious thinking, just spiraling out of control and keeping you from focusing on what you wish you were doing, or the people that you wish that you had focus on, as well as other things like work, class, things like that. And so symptoms of ADHD and anxiety, interestingly, often overlap, which creates this giant question mark of, am I anxious because I can't pay attention, or can I not pay attention because I'm anxious? And so this battle of, one of the books that I recommend at the end of the presentation presents this dynamic of worried voice versus false comfort, which is that what if versus the brain trying to calm itself down. The worried voice says, oh, well, you could be a horrible person. What about that thought? And then false comfort goes, no, you're not a horrible person. That's just crazy. And then worried voice goes, but what if it's true? Because that one person yesterday told you that you were really rude. And then false comfort goes, no, that was just one person. It's not, that's not reflective of everybody ever. But then worried voice will keep coming up with reasons why you should entertain this idea that you're a horrible person, while false comfort keeps trying to tamp you down with logic. Of course, that's not what it is. Like, be logical about this, be this. And the only voice in there that has any say to diffuse this is the voice of acceptance, which is, I'm having this thought right now, and that's not really in line with the kind of person that I am. So I'm gonna release this thought. I'm gonna choose not to pay attention to it. And that sounds, in my experience, when I broach that to clients, they're like, that sounds impossible. I will never be able to do that. That is like the only thing I've ever wanted to do, and it's just too hard to ever get there. And there's a lot of work that goes into that worried voice and false comfort mitigation with acceptance. But part of it is knowing that you've gotten caught in a loop, and we're not going to get anywhere by having both voices argue over each other inside your head about what is reality and what's not. And so back to the ADHD and anxiety overlapping component, there are a lot of different mental health conditions that overlap with ADHD or anxiety or trauma that kind of compound on each other in the way that it's difficult to pay attention because being hypervigilant is a trauma response, but also it could be hard to pay attention because your brain is going 1,000 miles an hour, and it always has done that, and that's how you intake information, versus your brain's going 1,000 miles per hour because you're in an anxious spiral. So there are all sorts of ways to like disentangle those different conditions, and that's a therapist's job. That's not any of your job. But that makes it a little bit harder sometimes to figure out what, like, the response that you're having. Is it anxiety? Is it something else? And trying to mitigate that too. So that's like the icing on the cake, right? We have biology in the back of our brain here, our survival brain going, you know what? Like, you should freak out right now because this seems like a good time to freak out. Like back 100, 200,000 years ago, we would have freaked out if something like this happened. On top of, we have dueling voices in our brain to try and get us to calm down, but also to hype us back up to trust that that biological cue in the back of our brain is real and that we should be worried about that. And then we have this other layer, the icing on the cake, of, oh, well, it might not be anxiety that's creating all of this stress for you. It could be all these other conditions that are unmanaged or that are compiled on top of each other to make this difficult. So I spend a lot of time explaining this and like trying to lay all this out there for my clients when we work with anxiety to kind of reassure and like validate the struggles, because like you're literally working against your outdated brain. And that is a really hard thing to do successfully. And in that anxious moment, the front of your brain, your executive functioning, the part of your brain that helps you use language and make choices based on things you've learned in the past, is no longer functioning when you're up there. And so to expect yourself to be able to manage that, your back part of your brain with your front part of your brain, when they were designed for very different reasons, is just, nobody can do that. Whether they have anxiety or they have something else, nobody is able to manage that part of their brain that way. And so that's why I like to bring up the physiological aspect and all of these other like more clinical aspects of this, to just really drive home that, you know, you this is a struggle for you, not because you're failing, but because it's just a really hard system to try and override. And so I want to say that first before I move on here to this slide. But it may sound impossible, but it is actually impossible to be anxious in a calm body. I heard this during one of my trainings, and it was like one of the best things I ever heard, because I'll tell it to clients and they'll be like, "What? Really?" I'm like, "Yeah, like you just, if your body is calm, which is the driver of your biological anxious response, then your mind can't be anxious." And so if it sounds too good to be true, I have a few things that you can try to prove me wrong. The first one is, sound cliche, tale as old as time, but a breathing exercise. They're recommended for a reason, right? And it's the same reason that related to the biological structure of anxiety. When you get anxious, what happens to your heart rate? It shoots up. What else starts to happen? You start to breathe faster, and that starts to also influence how fast your heart rate is going. And all of those like start pitching in a little cycle to really elevate your system. And so maintaining steady breathing rhythm, breathing different ways. So there's like diaphragmatic breathing exercise is a good one, where you put your hand on your diaphragm and your belly, kind of. It's like belly breathing for anyone who was a singer or in choir or something. And to practice filling your entire like diaphragm with air and then expelling it. And then noticing how fast you're breathing, the effort to slow breathing. There's also there's square breathing, which you can also kind of watch on a screen if you watch a video, because it goes along and then you can kind of track with your eyes, if you're a very visual person, like how many counts in and out you're supposed to be breathing. There's also, I don't know if anyone does yoga here, but there are various different breathing rhythms or strategies for yoga that are meant to help like calm while you're working through the physical process. One of the ones that we always did, I think it was breathing in through the nose and out loudly through the mouth. And there's also another version of that, which is called cool breathing or something, where you like breathe in through like kind of like your tongue and your teeth, and it feels cold like when you breathe in, and then you breathe out through your nose. And so the cool thing about now is we have a lot of smartwatches rolling around in the world, which can actually help you prove whether this works or not. When you're feeling anxious, you're wearing your watch, you have a really good piece of biometric data to support, like, oh, and the watch goes off when you're stressed, and it's like, hey, you're stressed, maybe you should breathe. Like, it's tracking that biometric data to offer you that suggestion, because that is the remedy to essentially like the biological response to the anxiety. Now, there are a couple of other options if you don't like breathing. At least that helps in the moment. But what about all those other moments when you're not in a panic attack or you're not at the height of your anxiety? Like, what do you do then? And so what I typically try to help clients with when I first meet them is beginning a daily mindfulness practice. And so, Marcus,
Hey,
does someone have
Jen.
a question?
Yeah, I was going to sorry to interrupt, but yeah, we do have some
Nope.
comments and questions if you want to do those before you move on. Hey, Jen, I think you muted yourself as well.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me now?
Yeah, we
Okay.
can hear you.
Okay, so the first question, or is kind of like a comment, I want to be careful with when we, in terms of information that we're, like personal information that we share during this, because it is being recorded and sent to however many people registered for this. So I don't necessarily want to read more like clinical personal information aloud if it ends up in the chat, but know that I am reading it. I see that, and I empathize with you. In terms of this one, there's a question from Georgia. If you're on medication that increases heart rate, is there a way to achieve the calm state still? And I think that's a good question. If your natural, so I guess that goes back to kind of like your baseline heart rate. If you're working off of, we're just talking about when the anxiety elevates the heart rate and not your like baseline heart rate. So if your baseline heart rate is elevated all the time because of the medication, we're now talking about the heart rate on top of that when you're having an anxious moment. And that can be mitigated by breathing still. Yes. I hope that answers your question. And so, and I'm going to keep going and keep putting questions. I'm going to try to do a better job paying attention now that Marcus has helped me with that. But something that I start doing with my clients right off the bat is we try to begin a daily mindfulness practice. And so when I say mindfulness, it's kind of the same thing that I do when we just defined anxiety not that long ago, or like generalized anxiety disorder and made it clinical versus everyday. Mindfulness has been portrayed a lot to mean meditation, and those are not necessarily the same thing. You have to be mindful to meditate, but you do not have to meditate to be mindful. And so mindfulness, the thing I like about it most is it's really easy to integrate into your daily schedule, because you can be mindful while you're doing essentially anything. You can be mindful while you're exercising. You can be mindful while you're cooking. You can be mindful while you're walking. You can be mindful anytime you want and for as long as you want. And what I tell my clients, like, I don't care how long you're mindful for. You don't have to make it like a task. You don't have to do it at the same time every day. But having that moment of being focused in the present. Oh, I'm in the shower and the water is slowly running down my arms, draws your attention away from the thousands of other narratives that are going on in your head while you're trying to plan the next 3 hours of your future or initiate anxious thinking. And building that mindfulness from a neutral setting where you're like actively trying it out and changing the pathways that your brain is thinking front focused or back focused to the past or the future, eventually becomes a coping strategy for stressful times and anxious times, because you can take yourself out of that in your head moment. That's the eventual buildup. So we build up from the neutral setting of like, oh, I'm just noticing stuff around me, to, okay, I'm noticing that I'm anxious. Where am I feeling it in my body? And that can keep you from getting to the full panic attack mode of when I get anxious, I really start to like feel this heat in my chest or in my hands or in my face. And so when you start to feel it, that becomes your physical cue, just like the heart rate increasing, like I'm about to be really anxious. And it can start informing you of, what did I miss? Like, how did I get here? And can start to digest that a little differently. And it all just starts with trying to integrate that into your normal daily activities without trying to make it a whole new thing. Like, oh, I have to now do 10 minutes of this every day, because we're all really busy and it's really hard to do that. And so to make it as easy on yourself as possible to just integrate it when you can or when you remember, and also to be kind to yourself when your thoughts drift, because that's the great thing about mindfulness. Meditation is hard because you're not supposed to let your thoughts drift. The thing about mindfulness is when your thoughts drift, oh, okay, there they went. Oh, I noticed that they drifted. Now I can bring them back. To start teaching you, hey, I do have control over what's going on in my brain. I am able to bring my thoughts back if they go somewhere I don't want them to. And that is, again, that's the end point. That's not like after 5 days of mindfulness we're going to get to that target. I have people that I work with on the more moderate side of the anxiety scale, and it takes about a year in my experience with them to reach a point of being able to consistently bring that back by themselves without a therapist's help to call them that to their attention or to go into full crisis mode to realize that. So when I'm offering these are not like, oh, next week if I try all these, I'm going to be cool. Like, this is a long process that starts with catching yourself and catching thinking, and then implementing the changes, and then maintaining the changes. So I meant to say that at the beginning when I started talking, but I just want to put that out there if anyone's feeling invalidated that I'm like shooting out what seems like easy fixes. These are not easy quick fixes, and even if you've tried these before and they didn't work, I would be interested to know more about how that happened. But anyway, and then the last one on this slide is listen to a guided visualization. I'll use the example of I had a client who she's really, since Christmas is coming up, she really likes Christmas. It's like, when I think about Christmas, I feel so good. I feel so happy. Like, I can't wait to think about Christmas. And I'm like, cool. How about you have, like, because there are not a lot of guided visualizations out there about Christmas that aren't about sleep. So that may be something that you find is a lot of guided visualizations are meant to help you fall asleep. Like, oh, like the forest that you're walking through, or, and when I say guided visualization, I mean like, kind of almost like a book on tape for yourself, but like walking through your mind. So, oh, imagine a place where you feel most calm, or some of them will be area specific, like a beach or the forest that I just mentioned. Like, imagine the waves like lapping your feet while you're walking up and down. Like, those, a lot of those are written to help you fall asleep, but they can also be written for managing your high anxiety moments. And so I recommended to her, this client of mine who really liked Christmas, and we couldn't find much about Christmas. Ask someone who you love, or you care about a lot, or ask someone whose voice you like, that you love, right, to help you narrate one of these for you so that you can listen to that when you get stressed. And there are tons of creative ways to do that in addition to that, but that can also be a way of like your unique guided visualization environment, like whatever that is for you. If it doesn't exist on the internet, like, can make your own. And so that's one of my other recommendations and that's kind of a moment. Some people compare it to guided meditation. And again, we use the word meditation, but it's another time for you to kind of come down into your body from your head and have somebody narrating something along with you to keep you in the more calm state. And so moving into perfectionism a little bit, the main thing that people, at least therapists, like we talk about with perfectionism is black and white thinking. So black and white thinking typically ends up, it's also called all or nothing thinking. So by some people, so you may have heard it said that way, but 100 or nothing. You're either all in or you're not in at all. You are either going out to your party or you're at home and you just are resigned to not have any fun. And so that kind of attitude stems really closely from anxiety because it's kind of like, oh, well, kind of back to the almost like trauma way of thinking of, oh, well, if I overthinked to like kind of predict what other people are gonna think about me if I say this, then I'll keep myself from feeling embarrassed. That same line of thinking of if this, then that is very much related to the perfectionist black and white scenario, because you're either perfect or you weren't worth it. And so sometimes black and white thinking can also have its roots in different cultures. And these can be family cultures or like larger cultural groups. So, like one of them, like if you don't go to church, some people would say, oh, you're not a believer if you don't go to church, like you don't believe in God. Or if you don't get good grades, then you can't be smart because you didn't do well in school. So that doesn't mean you're not an intelligent person. And so some of those lines of thinking depend more on your external system than your internal system. They're reinforcing you to have that kind of thinking. And so how do we work with that? And it is the solution you might have thought it is to lean into the gray areas. And so what happens when we lean into the area between 0 and 100? Well, we're acknowledging that more than two solutions to a problem can generate empathy and open-mindedness toward others, which improves your interpersonal relationships. So you might, if your significant other goes, well, there's only one way to do the dishes, and that's not it. Black and white thinking right there. It could be like, well, this is my way to do the dishes. Or like, I understand if you have your own way to do the dishes, or whatever. Maybe that's a silly example. But the root of that being, being able to be a little bit more flexible with that can allow other people to kind of be their truer self with you, and you like have a closer relationship with someone from that. And so before I get too distracted, this person says, Jesus says, I feel like I have a lot of black and white thinking and it's something I need to work on. Thank you for shouting that out here. It's a thing that a lot of us maybe don't realize that we have to work on until it shows up, like someone names it for us, and then we're like, oh, that's what I do. I do this. So I appreciate that. One of them is, again, acknowledging that there's more than just two solutions to any given problem. Like we have right, we have wrong, and sometimes those seem like really starkly like there can't be anything in between. But there can be, oh, it was right in this situation, or it was wrong in this situation, but in this one it would be this. And that can be kind of uncomfortable to explore. And so, I'll skip to the last one when I say that, about thinking critically about what makes you uncomfortable with gray areas. Is it because it's morally ethical? Like when I say right or wrong, does that go like, yeah, there's only one of those. Like there's no way, there's no in between there. And how that extrapolates to other scenarios of like something as mundane as doing the dishes, like that's a little extreme. So, who or what taught you that? Because that's not something that we're born with, this sense of, yeah, this is black or white. Like that's something that kind of we generate over time. So who or what taught you that that was a helpful way to think? And how does that gray area resonate with your identity now? Like, is gray still useful to stay away from? Is it not useful to stay away from anymore? Is it inhibiting your ability to have good relationships or to get things done? And then back up to the middle bar here to practice in thinking in terms of probability versus possibility. This is one I actually used to practice a lot with younger kids, but one of these, probability, is fueled by an acknowledgement of chance and acceptance that some things are up to chance. And possibility is fueled more by anxiety, like there's a possibility that this could happen. Yeah, that's true. There's a possibility that a lot of things could happen, but how probable is it that it will happen? And that's kind of a way, maybe to some of you that might sound too close to my kind of story before of worried voice and false comfort of like, no, one of them is telling you like, oh, there's a logical amount of percentage that this might happen versus an illogical percentage that this might happen. But the difference here is, again, acknowledgement of chance and acceptance that there's the chance versus like, oh yeah, there's a chance, and like, but it's not going to happen, kind of like writing that off. And so that's pretty much. And the last thing here is, why is all this so important if you're a young adult? Why is this, it's important all the time, but why is it so important now? And to answer that, kind of, I have another question, which is that depends on what your definition of a young adult is. If the person who came up with the like stages of development that we know today, psychologically, there are Erickson stages of development, if you guys are interested in looking that up. He came out with that in 1950, and Freud came out with his psychosexual stages of development earlier than that. So we're talking about, a 19 to 40-year-old in the 1950s, or a 12 to 18-year-old in the 1950s versus one of those people now. So I included both of these areas here because I feel like, the average 18 to 20-year-old in 1950 was looking at getting married and starting a family within, 2 to 5 years. And now it's a little bit more shocking to hear about an engagement straight out of high school, or even while students are actively enrolled in their undergraduate degree. And so that, that kind of puts these age brackets that this one guy came up with for the developmental milestones we're supposed to be hitting at these times a little differently, because our average 18 to 20-year-old today is probably a little bit more having issues with identity versus role confusion, which is that stage of, who am I in the context of relationships, of social environment, like who do I prefer sexually, what do I want to study, what kind of career do I want to have, like all of those kinds of identity related questions, versus someone who's in an intimacy and isolation stage of development comes after, of like really solidifying those closer family oriented relationships or partnerships or whatever that looks like, and making sure that that is met. So there is some evidence to suggest like that when these developmental stages get skipped or they get halted, that it creates issues later on in life when you're trying to hit different developmental stages. And so, to say that this is important in the scheme of managing anxiety and perfectionism, like this is what it could cost you. Being so preoccupied with anxiety and perfectionism could lose you your true identity, the identity that you otherwise would have had if you weren't too focused on what other people thought of you, or what expectations were on you, or the anxiety of, just trying to survive, versus the intimacy versus isolation that can cost you your closer, more familial relationships, again generating feelings of loneliness, and that isolation where the intent of the anxiety was to try and get you those relationships, to try and keep you from saying something uncouth or uncool that would keep you from being able to make those relationships. It becomes a double-edged sword that actually knocks you down. And so that's kind of, again, that's why it's important as a young adult, because you're going through either of these phases of life, this identity versus role confusion, this intimacy versus isolation, and the hangups on the anxiety and the perfectionism keep you from reaching that version of yourself that you otherwise would have if that wasn't the preoccupation. And so I think there's another question in the chat, which I'm able to hear. Please make sure you didn't accidentally lower. Oh, okay. Someone can hear me. I think I might have had a glitchy moment, so hopefully that passed. But that's pretty much all that I had. I can't believe that lasted almost an hour. I'm very surprised I was able to talk that long. Does anybody have any questions about anything I talked about that you want to jump in with now? Either again, like with video or with your mic, or on the chat. I'm happy to take those. And my question for you all is, what coping technique or new way of thinking about anxiety will you take away from today's presentation? And you don't have to answer that when I ask that right now, but again, opening this up to any further questions before I kind of close out here. I don't see anything. Okay, well, sounds like people are dropping off. I have some recommended reading here that I pulled from, oh, there's somebody. Oh, feedback form. Yes. So thank you, Marcus. Please don't forget to fill out the feedback form for the presentation. Please be honest. I'm a big girl. We're all trying to make sure that these presentations do well to help get what you needed out of the time. This is my recommended reading for everybody, where I pulled a lot of the thoughts and topics from today's presentation for overcoming unwanted intrusive thoughts. CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. Happiness Trap is by Ruth Harris, who writes a lot of ACT literature, which is acceptance commitment therapy. Behave, the biology of humans at our best and worst. The Mayo Clinic Guide to Stress-Free Living just has a lot of mindfulness-focused elements in it that I think are useful. And then The Body Keeps the Score, if we're talking about trauma being what informs a lot of your anxious thinking or perfectionist thinking. Bessel van der Kolk is your guide. That book's been around. It's like the staple of trauma information. It can be a little dense, especially for a non-therapist, but take your time, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. Again, linking the biological, the physiological aspect to the mental. And so, oh, one of my friends sent me a message. That felt like 10 minutes. Okay, cool. Glad I felt like 10 minutes to you. That's awesome. Okay, thank you everybody for the feedback. I like it. Last slide here is just about a little bit more about me if you're interested. I am accepting a few new clients at this time. So if you're interested, my website is at the bottom of here. Marcus is one of our wonderful administrators, and he helps book appointments. If you call our main number, he's really great at getting you in touch either with me or with somebody else who might fit better with your schedule to help manage these issues. And again, here's our number, anything related to that. And lastly, this is my email address if you want to reach out to me directly with any questions, set up a consult, which I can do for free, 15 minutes. I'm really, again, maybe if you just wanted to say, that was cool, thank you for sharing that. I like emails. So anyway, I appreciate you guys joining me today. I hope that you got what you needed from this. Again, this is very introductory. I kind of crammed a lot of what I talked to my clients about in like hours of time into one, like 50 minutes. So if it felt like I was trying to cram a lot of information here, I was. But I hope that it was helpful for you all, and that you all are able to take something from this and apply this to what you're trying to get out of managing anxiety and perfectionism. So anybody else? Very informative. I think one of the things I learned was not to guess what could happen. Yeah, cool. Yep. No mind reading, no assuming. Those are the cognitive behavioral terms for those distortions. And cool. Very practical. Yay. All right. Well, thank you guys for the feedback in the chat. I appreciate that too. And we just have one more minute. If anyone needs to say anything else, I'll be on here until it says 8, and then I will bid you all good night. Thank you guys again for participating.